women's economic rights. I'm Caroline Harper. I'm the director of the Gender Equality and Inclusion Unit in London, at ODI in London. I'm standing in for Dora Meredith, who unfortunately can't be here. She's director of the ODI Europe office, which we've established here in the last year. But I'm delighted to be opening this event on behalf of ODI and UN Women. So ahead of CSW68 and International Women's Day, we're taking a look at the policies that can help enhance women's economic power and shift gender norms. In a time when women's rights are being actively eroded, including in Europe, where we are facing a potential rollback on progress with the prospect of the upcoming elections, with us focusing on what works to accelerate the achievement of gender equality in the economy. Women's economic capacity can cement and anchor their rights in other ways unpredictable environments, and it's thus pivotal to all of our capabilities. Florence, do you want to introduce Florence from UN Women?
Thank you. So I'm the director for UN Women in Brussels, and very pleased as well to welcome you all and to get to know you and to exchange. And maybe just to add to what you've said, is that I think with ODI and with Dora, when we first met, it was right away a match, let's say, in terms of common interest and concern, of course, in terms of the backlash everywhere, but as well in Europe, but also wanting to really join efforts in terms of research, advocacy, thinking, getting different audiences together to see how we can really keep the framework of women's rights at where we stand and move forward and not backward. And this will be also the challenge of this year's CSW. You've mentioned CSW. CSW68, as you know, is on eradicating feminized poverty. We will hear more about it, but more than, let's say, a framework of agreed conclusions, the challenge will really be, I think, for member states to agree on how to do that, and how to do that not just through institutions and policy, but through financing. And that brings me to International Women's Day tomorrow this year, which for the United Nations is Invest in Women and Girls. And I think if there's a common denominator where we have had less attacks, and I say we, the gender community, UN Women, but all of us, in the last years, is probably women's economic empowerment. So it is not the magic bullet, but it is definitely a road forward where there's more consensus or less dissent, let's say, in times of gender pushback. So very, very pleased to be here and keen to hear and contribute as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we'll introduce our panelists in a moment, but just to explain how we're going to run this session. So first of all, we'll hear directly from Rachel Marcus, who is the author of our report, and she'll share the top line messages. Then we'll move to an open dialogue with the speakers. One of our speakers is also online, and this is being live streamed. So they will reflect on the implications of the research and how to take some of the findings forward in multilateral policy spaces like CSW68 and the EU. Then there will be audience Q&A. So please do think, if you're online as well, what you would like to ask. If you're online, you can use the Q&A function in the Zoom box down below on your screen. So please do send in your questions. So I'm going to hand over now to Atif Somji, who will I introduce. He's a senior research officer in the team in London, and he will be our You're moderator. You're moderator. Yeah, he'll be our moderator for the afternoon.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Laurence. Bonsoir à tous et toutes. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today, and I'm delighted to be moderating this esteemed panel here to talk about something that we're all passionate about. Before turning to Rachel, who will share some of the sort of key findings from our report, I wanted to introduce our esteemed guests. So if I start with Samira, we have Samira Rafaela, MEP, who is an MEP from the Netherlands, is a member of the FEM committee, so the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, and also on international trade. Next, we have Naila Kabir, who is a professor of international development and faculty at the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE, London School of Economics. And finally, I hope online, we have Jemima Njuki, who is the Chief of Women's Economic Empowerment at UN Women. So before we start the conversation, Rachel, I'll just hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ati. It's an honor to be part of this meeting and have this opportunity to share our report. We have the first slide, please. Yeah. Gender economic inequalities are among the most persistent and significant of global gender gaps. Women are more likely to be poor than men to be poor. They're less likely to be in work or training and less likely to own property or control income. On the slide, we put a few examples to show the scale of the problem. Gender norms are an important factor that contributes to keeping women excluded from economic gains. But what are they? Well, they're part of the glue that holds all societies together. We're socialized into gender norms from birth, including norms that uphold inequalities. This long and deep process of socialization means that whether in families, workplaces, or policy circles, we're not always aware of the norms that influence us. And of course, unequal gender norms benefit some people, which means they have an active incentive to uphold them. People working for women's economic empowerment often recognize how important these norms are, but at the same time, initiatives often pay little attention to them. Policymakers and program implementers may consider that tackling unequal gender norms is too difficult, or it takes too long, or it's out of the scope of a project, or it's someone else's responsibility. And we would argue that this isn't the case. Our report seeks to fill two gaps. The first one is to clarify how gender norms contribute to inequalities in different areas of economic life. And the second is to bring together the scattered evidence of how to shift norms that underpin gendered economic inequalities for more effective change. So the figure on the slide that you can see shows the main areas we focus on in the report. We look at 4 key sets of norms that affect women's economic rights and empowerment. The first one, the norms that assign unpaid care principally to women, alongside a norm that men should be principal income earners. Norms about who should own resources or make decisions on economic matters. Norms about respectable behaviour for women and men. And norms about the acceptability of gender-based violence, which can affect the sorts of work that it's safe for women to do. And we discuss others as well, but in every part of the report, we discuss these 4. And we look at how these norms operate in relation to 4 key areas of women's economic empowerment: employment, access to land, livestock and other assets, financial inclusion, and entrepreneurship. We also have discussed how these norms intersect with the broader economic environment and the political and legal context. Another key factor is the availability of public services such as education, healthcare, social protection, and access to family planning. Though there is much more that can be said about these intersections and we could cover in the report. It can seem that unequal gender norms are hard to shift, but our report shows that there are lots of inspiring examples of how it can be done, both at large and small scale. And it's worth remembering that economic incentives can be really powerful drivers of change. In the report, we distinguish indirect and direct approaches to change, and the diagram on the next slide shows a couple of examples. The direct routes are ones that explicitly seek to challenge an existing norm or promote a new one. These could be things like media campaigns or community-based initiatives to change hearts and minds. They also include legal reforms that compel or incentivize change. For example, evidence from Europe shows that introducing or increasing paternity leave has helped change norms about responsibilities for childcare. Some other examples we discuss in the report are media campaigns to shift norms about women's entrepreneurship in Turkey, community-based programs that include dialogue on gender roles. For example, work with small-scale farmers to challenge norms about who can own and control assets like land, livestock, fishing equipment, and other farming assets. And importantly, these programs also backed up norm change initiatives with inputs to strengthen value chains and enable men and women to gain better returns to their labour. And both these examples, though they're very different, also point to the importance of women and men both having a stake in the proposed change. In terms of indirect approaches, these often involve longer routes to norm change. They could include encouraging structural shifts like increasing access to education for both boys and girls, or expanding economic opportunities. Though these don't automatically lead to shifts in gender norms, most evidence suggests that they're important factors underpinning change. Other indirect approaches focus on the factors that hold a norm in place. For example, providing safe and cheap public transport doesn't necessarily change gender norms directly, but it does reduce a barrier that keeps women out of the workplace and over time can help shift norms. Some other examples of indirect approaches are increasing the availability of childcare services or increasing women's access to mobile phones and digital financial services. Sometimes these indirect measures can be enough on their own to lead to a shift in norms. In other situations, they're more effective when combined with direct measures. For example, combining safer public transport with enforcing laws against gender-based violence or campaigns to change people's mindsets. Clearly, what's most effective in any given situation will depend on both the specific norms in place and the broader economic and political context. In the panel discussion, we'll be drilling down into some of what's proved effective in different contexts and why and how different actors, legislators, policymakers, civil society, and the private sector can help spearhead change to build a more gender equal economy. We can move to the next slide. So copies of our report are available in English. The summary reports are available in English, French, and Spanish on the table outside, or on our website, where you can also download the full report. The QR code will take you straight there. I'll now hand over to Atif, who'll be moderating the discussion, and to our esteemed panelists. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rachel, for that really insightful presentation of our findings. Great, let's get the conversation going, shall we? Maybe I can start with Jemima, if that's okay, online. So Jemima, if we can start with you. Great, welcome. What are the key components of your work leading women's economic empowerment at UN Women? And why do you think changing gender norms is so important for this cause?
Thank you so much, Atif. It's a pleasure to join you and to see some old friends and colleagues in the audience. This question is very timely, particularly amidst the pushback that we are experiencing on gender equality. And as the first speaker said, as we prepare to commemorate the International Women's Day ahead of CSW, which is starting next week. So I lead UN Women's Economic Empowerment section, and we focus on 3 strategic areas that we believe are key to influencing transformative change for women. We know that economic empowerment is pivotal. We know we are operating in an economic structural system that doesn't always work for women. And so our goal is to change that system so that it can work for women. So we have 3 key priorities that we are focusing on. We focus on decent work and entrepreneurship as one priority. We focus on transforming care systems, and we also focus on gender responsive climate action. We know underpinning these 3 critical areas is the right gender responsive macroeconomic policy that supports women's economic empowerment. Changing harmful norms is especially critical to achieve these 3 areas. And we also know that financing for gender equality is needed in order to influence change. So I want to talk about the 3 key areas and what we're doing around changing norms in those areas. In terms of addressing women's decent work and entrepreneurship, and I think Rachel has highlighted this in terms of how some of the norms in this space determine what work women can do, what work they cannot do, what resources they can and cannot own. We know women predominantly are occupying insecure, low-wage roles, particularly in the informal economy. We know there is a persistent gender pay gap where women are being paid 20% less than men are paid. And so we see transforming social norms around gender and work, helping us to break down the structural barriers that exist and creating more opportunities for women in formal and secure employment. The second area on transforming care systems, we know it's crucial. We champion the care economy as critical for realizing the interconnectedness of human rights, of gender equality, of sustainable development, and the achievement of more feminist economies. Care is vital for the well-being of society and economies, and yet we know that women around the world have been subsidizing, that's what I like to call it, because of social norms, because of the undervaluing and the lack of recognition of the value of care to societies. This work has disproportionately fallen on women. It has been underinvested in, and we really are working to change the status quo so that we see care as a public good, so that we break those norms and barriers that perceive care work as women's work, and that continue to contribute to the undervaluing of care. And this has involved engaging men around gender equality, having a lot of dialogues about the value of care, and pushing for the recognition of care work and as part of contribution to countries' GDP. We are working a lot on the area of gender responsive climate action here. A lot of our work focuses on increasing access to technologies, climate resilient technologies, to women and girls around the world, to reducing, again, connected to the area of care, reducing the domestic work around energy access, but also making sure that women are they're playing a role and are playing there and occupying their space in the just transition, including in engaging in renewable energy. And the other thing we are focusing on here is access to land. We know that in a lot of countries, a lot of women do not have access to land, and by challenging norms around land ownership and combining that with legal protections for women's land rights, that we can achieve better outcomes for women in terms of their ownership of productive resources. So by challenging these norms, we know we can ensure that women have access to these resources and to empowering them to achieve financial independence, economic autonomy, and basically to thrive in an environment where norms are not a barrier to what they can and cannot do, what they can and cannot achieve.
Naila, you've been working in this area for decades. What role do you see gender norms playing in holding women back economically, in terms of equal work, equal pay, and basically equal economic power?
Well, one of the things that strikes me when we look at the global gender gap that the World Economic Forum publishes every now and again, is where we are seeing the closing of the gender gap and where we're not. So we're seeing the closing of the gender gap in human well-being, health, education, important, but not necessarily leading to agency. We don't see we see continuous gaps in economic sphere, opportunities, paid work, etc. And the largest gap is in politics. So you can really understand the structure of power. Where does it matter? And the fact that we are so far away from, I'm just going to do the microphone so you can okay. The fact that we're so far away still from equality in politics also means that we're far away from all the other things. So if I had to think about why it has been proven so difficult and why we're getting backlash every now and again, there are two kinds of histories at work. Patriarchy is systemic, right? When Rachel pointed out, we're talking about the inequality of resources, inequality of responsibilities, inequality of authority, and these things work together. The fact that you are primarily responsible for unpaid care work means you cannot go and a job, a decent job, a well-paid job. You cannot go and run both politics. The fact that you are supposed to be a male breadwinner means you don't want your wife or people going out. So all these things work together, and we're sometimes trying to pick away at one thing at a time. Really, we need to work on all of it. So that's one history. This has evolved over many decades, if not centuries, and we are trying to overcome it in a very short space of time. Right? So that's ambitious. But the other history is our own histories. When we talk about norms, we all grew up internalizing certain, I call them values. They become a part of us. So we become as much colluders in our own oppression as those who are seeking to. So in a sense, this battle around norms is also a battle around getting people to think for themselves rather than just to do what society tells them to. So I think for me, it's opening up the opportunities, and that can be through these economic spaces, opening up the possibilities for networks and, you know, new role models and so on. It's how do you get people to be willing to stand up for themselves? I think if they were more willing and less frightened of the consequences, I think we would see change.
Speaking about women in politics, Amira, from your position, so within the European Parliament, but also as a member of those committees I mentioned earlier, you have debated policies, you have debated legislations promoting women's economic empowerment. So how do you see gender norms getting in the way of a more gender equal economy?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate this dialogue because that's going to be very important for the upcoming years, upcoming time to constantly put this on the agenda. Because indeed, what I notice as a legislator, as a legislator and politician, is that we deal with a lot of norms indeed that are built in a way. We work with systems, we are confronted with systems, organizations and structures that are mainly built on male norms. I'd say not so friendly for what is needed to have a fully effective participation of women in society. And this is exactly what we need to change. But at the same time, I also realize and experience that we're having a backlash here because there's also a very dedicated strategy going on at the moment to attack these norms. But I think that's interesting for the later part of this panel. And when it comes to the gender norms getting in the way of more gender equal economy, what I notice, the first thing I always notice when I negotiate about legislation, this week on the forced labor ban instrument, for example, a lot of men sitting at the negotiating tables. And it already starts there, like who sits at the table, who is part of the decision-making process. Because if you don't sit at the table, it means that you are not part of the solution and not part of the powerful decisions that are being made on your behalf, in your name, and it's going to impact your life. So I think that's the very first thing that we need to keep working on, that is the participation of women at the decision-making table. And I always say, if you work on strengthening the economic and financial position of women, then you make them less vulnerable to all kinds of, forms of discrimination, but even violence. So it's very important to work at the core business here, and that's the economic empowerment of women and make them financially independent. So that's exactly why we have been working on the Women on Boards Directive, for example, to push companies in the EU to have significantly more women in the top level management of their companies. It's also why I'm very happy as lead negotiator on the Pay Transparency Directive that we will have this directive in place for in 2 years or so, meaning that companies will be obliged to report on their gender pay gap, because the information is power. If you have the knowledge, you have power. If you have the insight, you have power. So that's also what women need. They need insight and information on, for example, their salary. So how am I being paid compared to my male colleague who's doing exactly the same work? So we hope with this directive that we give the strong right to information to all EU workers, by the way. And then from there on, companies need to be obliged, but also inspired to work on their gender pay gap through mandatory reporting on that. So these are our examples of how we are trying to change these gender norms. But if you ask me, what is your specific experience as legislator and politician? Then I say more women at the decision-making table. Because that's where it all starts, and that is where you get the very valuable confidential information also on how decisions are made, structured, and organized. So let's also start there. And you know, one more reason why it is so important that we work on these gender norms is that it's just not fair that it's, you know, way easier for men nowadays to participate. I mean, in the workforce, in society in general. Take, for example, also the issue with childcare. It costs a lot for so many families, men and women in society. So what you see is that women end up at home. They take care of the family. Indeed, a lot of informal care that's not being recognized. They don't get paid for it. That means that a lot of women cannot invest in their future and they cannot organize their own future.
Thank you. I think what's really interesting there is we talked about gender norms in that first question, and we straight away gone to power, basically, having decision-making power. That's really what gets to the point of gender norms. Let's go on to what works next. So in policy terms, how can we shift those gender norms? Naila, your work in feminist economics, for example, underpins a lot of the thinking, but also the practice on women's economic empowerment. So could you tell us maybe from your research, what policies have you found that work well to shift gender norms? And maybe does it speak to this approach of the direct and indirect strategies for norm change?
I think the direct and the indirect have to work together. You know, I think you can pass laws, and unless there's an appetite for them on the ground, they're not going to be implemented. But I find it important to document the power of policy and the power of legal reforms, which I actually don't think of as direct. I think changing the law is different from having a campaign, right? Changing the law puts the power of the state behind the law. Because having a campaign leads to a bit of voluntary. But I think, you know, examples that I think of over the years is, you know, when Argentina made it legal to have part-time formal work, the number of married women who entered the labor market, because up to that point they've been excluded. In Morocco, they changed the family law, and it allowed a lot more younger women to take up work, because I think the issues about permission and so on. You know, in Vietnam, they had land legislation, you know, they could allow households to own land. But until they made space for a second name on the title deeds, only men got the land. So it's, you know, it's, and I think one lesson here is make it explicit. This is what we want to do. You know, a lot of things, especially at the lower level, attempt to do change structures or whatever, with telling the implementers that the aim of this policy is to try and address gender inequalities. The aim of doing a training program is not just to give people information, it's also to allow them to participate. And that means you have to make it possible for them to participate. So I think, you know, from what I've read on the Latin American case, is that having CEDAW there was very important for a lot of Latin American women's movements to fight for land rights. I think every country looks for strategies that are going to work in that country. You know, in Bangladesh, we passed a law against dowry in 1980, and dowry still continues to go up. You know, there is no appetite to stop dowry practices. What may change dowry, and this is what I'm finding, is more and more women are beginning to become economic actors and in reasonable jobs. And so more and more you're hearing, I am the dowry. You know, I'm not coming into marriage as a dependent. I'm coming into marriage as a breadwinner. So, you know, again, taking comments from the report, there are two real drivers of norm change, normative changes. One is poverty. People will do things because of poverty that they wouldn't have wanted to do. And the other is opportunity. The things you do because of poverty are not sustainable, because the moment you become better off, you revert. But when you respond to opportunities, then I think that it's the likelihood of the change being sustained over time. And the other thing that opportunities do is they open up a space for women themselves to renegotiate norms. And I'm just writing a book on Bangladesh, so all my examples are going to come from Bangladesh, I'm afraid. But I'm very fascinated in the way that labor force participation in Bangladesh has increased over time. And as it's increased and into the public domain, you hear the way that people are renegotiating cultural norms. So for instance, in the past, you only supposed, if you went for wage work, it had to be in your neighborhood. Anything outside was not acceptable. Now the idea of the outside has been defined further and further away until, I think there was one mother who said, oh, my daughter works inside, but she works in the Middle East. I mean, so the outside is inside as long as it's inside the house. Then the way that people talk about veiling, some people veil, other people say if you are modest, if you're decorous, it's fine. So I find when those opportunities are there, there's much more creativity of people. So you don't confront a norm because that gets you into, problems in your society. You just say the norm has not been transgressed. So I think that part of it is very important. I also want to say one other thing. When I said gender gaps have been closed in urban education, I think, is profoundly important. Because if all psychologists tell you that your early years of life are formative, education is when you get out of your own home and whatever you're being taught there. It's socialization process. You're into another space where you meet people from different parts of walks of life and so on. Even poor level education seems to have an impact on women's agency. Even poor level education improves the likelihood of decision making, reduces the likelihood of doubt. I think what we could do if we could really good quality education that told boys and girls that their gender didn't circumscribe the lives that they would lead. I think it's a missed opportunity. And I think a lot of the lower level interventions are actually about information, different kinds of information. So there's one set of information you have in politics. There's another set of information you have when parents find out that actually girls with education can not earn as much as boys. But parents have a very unrealistic idea of gender gaps in thinking. You can find out that there are jobs going somewhere else and they're recruited women. So different kinds of cognitive change are very central to the changing of norms. There's one study that was done by the RCT people, and like many RCT people, they didn't follow up to find out what lay behind their outcome, and it was an interesting outcome. So this was in Togo, and it was Marcus Goldstein and Campos and others. And I really want to know what went on. So they had a training programs for entrepreneurs, male and female. One was a standard business training. The other was life skills. They found that those entrepreneurs that only did business training, nothing much happened to their enterprises. Those that did both men and women, both the business ones and the life skills one, went on to report higher rates of profits, etc. Wouldn't you want to go back and find out what it was about those two different types of training which led one to have such an amazing impact? So I think really if we want to understand change and what makes change happen, we have to move away from evaluations that just tell us what works. We have to, I was talking to someone earlier about this, we have to acknowledge the wisdom of implementers, of people who work in the program. We have to acknowledge the wisdom of people around it. We have to know about motivation, right? And then we can replicate. But to try and replicate without understanding what you need to work in one context and not in another, it's a waste of opportunity.
Jemima, you are grappling with policy at the international level and also through UN Women's programs. So, from your experience, maybe just share with us briefly, what are the key gender norms related to we that you found most resistant to change? And what policy developments are you most excited about that can tackle them?
Thanks. I think I'll focus on two that we have been delving quite deeply into, and one is the norms around care work, because this is so critical. What we see is the norms around what we value and measure as a society, notably the perception that unpaid care work is not work. For example, that women are economically idle if they're not in a formal in a formal job, that it is not skilled and therefore overlooked in public policy making. And what is interesting about norms, not really interesting in a good way, is that they also in a lot of ways shape economic policy, because what we've seen as a result of these undervaluing of women's work is that at the macro level, this has translated into norms around what is being measured, what is being seen as contribution to economic progress or economic well-being. Now, a lot of what we have seen also in terms of how this is changing and shifting is when we start to have discussions about care as work, care as decent work, care not as a private good that women provide just within their homes, but care as a public good, that we start to see shifts in conversation. So there's conversations within the UN in terms of measuring economic well-being beyond GDP to include, care work as a contributor to economic progress. We've seen countries just by UN Women's support to collect data on time use surveys, then use that to start developing their national care policies. So we have a country like Kenya, where 2 years ago, we worked with them to include time use surveys in their national data systems. And now they're developing the first ever national policy on care. But we are also seeing other developments. Right now, we are working with the government of Rwanda on the reform of the family law, which is being tabled for approval in parliament. And the law is actually acknowledging domestic work as contributions to marital property. So we are seeing some of these shifts in how care is being perceived. At the global level, last year was actually a remarkable year because we pushed, along with other UN agencies, the first observance of the International Day of Care and Support by the UN system, and a resolution in the Human Rights Council as well, recognizing care as a right. And so we are starting to see these shifts, and a lot of it really driven by that global conversation that's changing some of the perceptions around the work on care. The other area that we are really seeing a lot of progress, and that's really important for women's economic empowerment, and Naila has mentioned this, is the norms around land rights for women. And this is where a lot of policy change is happening. It is affecting women's, and it's impacting positively on women's ownership of land, but also where a lot of work is needed because the norms there are much stickier than in other areas of ownership of resources. And I always give my own example because I come from Kenya, and in 2010, Kenya passed a new constitution that recognized inheritance rights for both boys and girls. And despite my father wanting to do this because he's one of my most admired feminists, he wanted to do this, it still took us about 3 years to get this done, for him to actually transfer his land to both his sons and his daughters, because the implementation framework and the societal norms had not changed quickly enough in line with some of the policy change. And so I also want to point to this very much community, individual level changes that need to happen. I think, Naila, you talked about this in terms of how people behave in ways that are not just conforming to what is expected. So we still need to do a lot of work in terms of that engagement, that at community level, at individual level, that reflections of our own belief systems that we've carried from childhood. And when people sit around the table, when decision makers sit around the table, they carry this with them in the decisions that they make. So there's also a lot of changes that need to happen to ensure that even policy changes that are aimed at changing these norms actually eventually have impact on the ground.
Samira, let's talk about the EU a bit. So the EU's gender equality strategy, so 2020 to 2025, it's giving clear policy objectives on things like closing the gender pay gap, which you mentioned, the gender care gap, I think as well, and balancing decision-making and politics, like we spoke about. So maybe what would you highlight as the most innovative policies that you're seeing at the state or regional level?
Yes, thank you. So a couple of things. Well, I already introduced a bit the Pay Transparency Directive. I truly think that's going to be an innovative directive because, like I said, information is power, and through transparency you can create solutions. Because if you don't demand transparency in this area, you will not have enough leverage. You will not have enough companies and organizations to say, okay, we will start working on it. From our own motivation. What has been very important in this directive is that for the first time in EU legislation, intersectional discrimination has been recognized. That was one of the main points that I wanted to address during these negotiations. I was really willing to walk away from the table if I would not get that in, because I explained to my co-negotiators and to the other institutions, not all women are the same. If we talk about women, we talk about so many different women. And depending on who you are, how you look like, what your name is, where you come from, what your characteristics are, what your what are the points that you're being recognized for. Depending on all these factors, you can be more discriminated or less discriminated, but at least we need to recognize here the intersectional element of it. So that has been taken into account now in this directive as an aggravated factor also for court cases. So I do think this directive will make women stronger through the recognition of the intersectional discrimination element of this law. What is very important also on the member state level is that we keep working, but mainly keep protecting feminist foreign policy. Also given the backlash, what you see, and I think given the results that we can expect, the election results, one of the first things that will be touched is the feminist foreign policy. So also here, there is a very important role for the multilateral organizations to, in a way, find a solution to protect feminist foreign policy, because that's really about increasing the participation of women in peace negotiations and decision-making processes, and make sure that they are really part of solutions on the ground. But it's also on a top management level here, from within the EU institutions, for example, making sure that there are women, there's female leadership at the table, and also going on these missions to do the negotiations, for example. I've mentioned already the Women on Boards Directive to bring in the gender balance in the corporate boards of the listed companies. But when we speak about innovation, for example, a couple of weeks ago, as rapporteur on the EU-Chile trade agreement, we had a very interesting, good result. And from the EU side, now we have the first EU gender and trade chapter. I truly think we should keep looking also into that direction when it comes to our trade agreements and economic partnerships, because I constantly repeat also in the European Parliament, we need to gender mainstream our economic partnerships in the world, because there's a lot of impact. And if you can arrange these gender provisions, and now we have a standalone gender and trade chapter in this Chile agreement. Also a thing I said, if I don't get it, then I will not give a positive advice in the Parliament for this agreement. Because now we have the momentum, now we have the opportunity to have a standalone gender and trade chapter, in which now is arranged that we take care of female entrepreneurs, that they get means, that they get finances, that they get training. E-commerce, the digital services is a very important sector to invest in for female entrepreneurs. So often when we speak about the topic of economic empowerment, I sometimes miss also the discussion on trade and the economic partnerships and the opportunities that we have there.
Thank you. Now I want us to look beyond those kind of top-down policy level changes and reflect on norm change that's driven, as we've kind of mentioned already, communities, but also in the workplace, and really what's proof effective in those contexts. So Naila, I'll come to you first, if you could just grab the mic, please.
Okay.
What do you see as the key drivers of norm change at these levels? And I'm, presumably from your work in the garment sector, that comes to mind as a good example.
Well, I've also done work in the microfinance sector, and I'm going to start with that. And I think one of the real lessons that have comes out of South Asia is the difference it makes when you organize women for microfinancial activities, the difference it makes the kind of groups you form. If the group is formed purely around repaying loans, the political potential is much lower. One of the interesting India comparisons is the self-help groups, which were organized around savings. But because the savings doesn't put that pressure on you to repay the loans, there's time to meet every week, every month, to get to know each other. And I've had people saying, I knew that woman, she was my neighbor, but our relationship has changed because now we see each other as a part of the group. So I think collective action is absolutely the key. And I think all the most important changes that have taken place, whether it's at the level of policy, practice, etc., has been driven by women organizing around their interests, very often in alliance with men. So if we then look at the garment sector, a lot of organizations in a lot of parts of the world, but also within the countries in which these industries were located, have tried to make the point that you have to bear in mind contradictory things. These jobs exploit women, these jobs empower women. And you cannot take these jobs away by saying that they're so exploitative and that we can't trade with Bangladesh, we can't trade. Because these jobs are better than any other job in the agricultural sector, in the field, of wage labor. So you have to bear in mind these two contradictory things. So the issue is, how do you improve the jobs? And I've been on the advisory group of the Better Works program. And I'm very impressed with their attempt to do it from the factory level up, right? So working with the managers, working with the trade unionists where possible, and so on. And it's slow, but it makes a difference. I think we have results from Vietnam, results from Jordan, results from Bangladesh. For these women workers, having the power of the trade union, of the international buyers and so on, means they're not alone. And I think when I talk about collective action, whether it's microfinance, self-help groups, whether it's women mobilizing around childcare provision, one of the things that is very frightening about change is isolation. And building your networks, creating cooperatives, Self-Employed Women's Association, which has been going on since the 70s, focuses on building cooperatives of informally employed women. And they have changed laws and they have changed policies. They've changed ILO conventions, and that's the power of what people can achieve when they're not isolated and when they're not having to bear the costs of challenging patriarchy. So I think, again, a very interesting study about Latin America, is they're trying to see what predicts the likelihood of a country not simply passing laws against gender-based violence, but actually training the police, providing shelters for abused women, doing all that needs to be done to make sure that action about gender-based violence has teeth. And they found that the single most important variable predicting it was the presence of autonomous women's movements. I mean, that was the single most important variable. It wasn't whether you're a left-wing party or right-wing, etc. So, and I think we can find those kinds of results on a number of different issues. Unfortunately, the funding that is drying up for UN Women and for, some of the bigger initiatives, it's also drying up for women's organizations, for smaller social movements. And it's very hard for people to achieve everything on voluntary time. So I really feel that this is something that, when we talk about finance, we need to think about financing the kind of motor, the driver of change from the grassroots.
Great, thanks. I mean, let's talk about that then, Jemima. I guess from your examples from UN Women's work, what's needed to support this bottom-up change? Is it really about the finances at key?
I think it's everything. Financing is important. I think what we have seen is, and coming back to Nyla's point, this power of grassroots organizing, collective action, of feminist movements, because we know there's a lot of change that has come about because of the organizing of women. But we are also seeing so little financing going to feminist organizations, going to grassroots organizations. So that's definitely an important thing. But I also want to talk about the power of networking and ensuring that we are facilitating change at multiple levels. And I'll just give the example of the care work that we do again. So as part of the Generation Equality Forum, we convene the Global Alliance for Care. And this is a network of organizations from government, international organizations, grassroots organizations, women's organizations from around the world that have come together to say, we need to transform care systems. We need to transform how care is viewed. And an important part of that engagement has been around grassroots women and making sure that they are connected to the global landscape in terms of what's going on. So in Mexico last year, we convened close to 50 grassroots organizations who work on unpaid care from 24 countries to really come together into a room to dialogue, including with the international trade unions and with governments around the work that they do, on care. So this idea that it's not just policy, it's also enabling and supporting the local organizations, the local feminist organizations that are driving change. The other thing I want to say is, and because we are also dealing with a lot of these issues at a time of really constrained fiscal space, that engagement with local governments, with municipalities, with different levels where change needs to happen is important. We've been having work in Senegal looking at women's insurance, the fact that a lot of rural women, despite a lot of the work that they do in sustaining our food systems, do not have access to basic things like insurance, and seeing how can local governments ensure that these processes, these conditions are available to women working in rural areas. So seeing some of that get embedded in local government policies, priorities, and investment plans is really important. The work that we do on gender responsive budgeting, because we really need to also change a lot of the policy rhetoric to actually money on the table and money attached to these changes. So our work on gender responsive budgeting around the world then takes these policy declarations and policy commitments by governments and say, how do you then reflect those in your budget? If you're talking about care as a public good, how do you then reflect investments in care in your budget? And how do we then see what are the implications for a country in investing in care services? Because that's the other route we've had to work, because a lot of governments see this as a cost, that we're just going to be putting money into providing care services. But we've been working with ILO and governments to say, actually, when you invest in care, you are investing in jobs, you are investing in expanding the tax base, you are investing in getting more women into the labor force participation. And that has implications for the global, for the wider development of the country. So it's really making sure that all these policy commitments are also being translated into practical action on the ground, but that there's actually money behind this. So just to say that it's going to take action at multiple levels. It's the legal frameworks, it's the policy commitments, but it's also the financing and the support to grassroots organizations, and especially to connect them to global processes and to sort of remove that isolation that Naila was talking about, that they are part of a wider community that's working for change. And that's where our work at UN Women with civil society organizations, with feminist organizations has been especially critical.
Thank you. I know we're pushed for time a bit, but do you want to
Just wanted to pick up on something, Joanna. You know, I acknowledge and recognize this idea of constrained fiscal space, but it's very ironic that we live in a world where individuals are richer than countries. You know, constrained fiscal space because we're not taxing them. You know, there is enough money in the world to pay for unpaid care. It should not be subsidizing growth in the economy and so on. But the constraint is coming because they don't contribute to the public good.
Well said. Thank you. Let's move on to politics now. Talk about policies, now let's talk about politics. So tell us, Samira, about the importance of political will to push forward gender equality and women in the economy. So I know, you know, on the one hand, as you've already mentioned, we've kind of got this beacon of feminist foreign policy shining bright. There's interest, there's commitment from your country and others. On the other hand, there's this worrying political shift to the right, and like you mentioned, this concerted and, by the way, well-funded backlash against women's rights. So how can we make sure that women's economic rights and empowerment remain high on the political agenda in places like the EU and in CSW? Yes.
Well, that's an extremely important debate that still is a difficult debate and conversation I noticed and experienced also in the European Parliament. I remember the very first time when I put the topic of the anti-gender movements, I prefer to call them anti-rights movements, on the agenda. I got a lot of questions like, what are you talking about? What is the anti-gender movement? So it's still a new topic in Europe. But I found out quickly that in the United States, there is already a lot of research being done. There is already a lot of coordination and insights on these anti-gender movements. And that's very interesting. I'm actually also now in contact with UN Women on the Push Forward strategy, for example, because I'm also making now a strategy against these anti-gender movements together with my team. And we received already very valuable information from UN Women. So I really commend the work also there with the Push Forward strategy. But indeed, it's a transatlantic, I'd say a transatlantic strategy that is well funded, well coordinated, very well financed. And indeed, there are a lot of rich organizations and individuals behind these movements. And the thing is that I also have a security background, so I also see it from the perspective of security, I nowadays say, because these are not simple ideologies or individual opinions. They don't stick to that. So there's really a dedicated strategy, so-called Agenda Europe strategy also here, to infiltrate in the multilateral organizations to really get the strategic positions where they can influence policy and legislation. And we have seen several examples already in the EU. Take, for example, legislation against the right to a safe and legal abortion, for example. I mean, we had the very terrible example here in the EU for the first time, a women's rights defender going to court because she wanted to assist in someone else to get an abortion. And she was convicted for it. And then even in Spain, we have an example of a women's rights defender who just gave her opinion on the right to abortion, and she needed to go to court for it. So just to give you a couple of examples how the anti-gender movements are really infiltrating in our systems, and this is really where we need a coordinated strategy against. So I highly advise multilateral organizations to have these multilateral stakeholder dialogues on how to counter it, because I also see the European Parliament on a legislative level that they are being effective in even, you know, amending out words like SRHR or words like gender. And then you think, oh, but they got this word out. Yes, but they got this word out. And if that's a pattern, if they keep doing that, then you end up also with defunding, for example, defunding civil society organizations that need to regulate and make sure that there's access to SRHR, for example. It has a lot of complications if you keep amending out the word gender, for example. So just to give you an example of the development that is going on. So what I am trying to do also with my team is to get a hold on the finances behind these movements. So I've been asking the European Parliament several times right now, please do research, good dedicated research on your transparency register, your lobby register, because we need to know who these people are, who are these organizations, where is the money coming from? So follow the money. That's very important. And I think if we can leverage the power and the influence that we have within the multilateral system, then we can be way stronger and have a stronger response to it. So we need multilateral coalitions, and we need indeed political will for that. It's going to be tricky, of course, this year in Europe, because we expect, from my perspective, as a social liberal, progressive, democratic person, we expect, a result that is going to be bad for protecting women's rights, for protecting gender equality, for protecting the LGBTI community, for protecting trans persons in our society, and so on. So obviously the far right and the ultra conservatives will win in Europe, and this is going to mean that they will touch upon the feminist foreign policy and all kinds of, you know, progressive legislation that we have been working on. So the work of UN Women, the work of UNFPA, the work of ODI, I mean, having already this conversation in one room is extremely important. So thank you very much also for organizing this, because we should not underestimate the power of that. And I hope that very concrete actions can follow also from it when it comes to the multi-stakeholders dialogues that we need to have. There's one, speaking about gender norms, by the way, there's also one topic that I'm also worried about. That's also about care, but not the same perspectives that we have been discussing now. But that's also the knowledge that we need to have on the impact of gender-related health issues. What I also see is that a lot of women nowadays, if we speak about poverty, take for example menstrual poverty, that's also a topic that we need to keep discussing and making sure that we have funding in place and keep supporting women and girls in having access to menstrual health, for example, because it impacts women and girls on a daily basis, immense. And when it comes to the medical community and the funding and the means that we need to get more knowledge on gender-related health issues, then I also see a challenge there. It's a topic that I now put on the agenda. I started last year an initiative, Let's Talk About Our Body. And that is precisely about getting more knowledge on, for example, the menstrual and the hormone-related health issues. And it impacts women on a daily basis. Speaking about the best practice on state level, for example, Spain has introduced menstrual leave, so that's incorporated now in their legislation. And I still see that this topic is in the taboo sphere, and we really need to talk more about menstrual poverty, about the gender-related health issues, because if we want more women to participate effectively on a daily basis in the workforce, then we need to get that topic out of the taboo sphere and really make it a topic that we speak dedicated about, because women suffer in silence speaking about this topic.
Yeah. I want to turn to you now, Naila. So you've been involved in feminist research and policy discussions for quite a long time now. Give us some perspective. You know, what we're seeing today, is this a cause for concern? Is it a cause for hope in some ways because things are improving, or where do you see where we are today?
I'm afraid, all my life I've been an optimist, and I've been able to take my classes with my students and leave them with hope. It's really something I believed in. I'm finding that much harder. I really am. I don't think one can pretend that the world is getting better and better and better. I think I don't understand what motivates these people to organize against women's rights. I don't understand what's in it for them. What's in it for them that a woman decides not to have an unwanted child and decides to have a wanted child? A wanted child is much happier than an unwanted one. And the slogan we used to have in the 70s about the right to abortion was, every child a wanted child, every mother a willing mother. And I think that is the best solution for the future. And I see all these rights that were fought for, being dismantled, being attacked, and I think, for me as an academic, what role do I have? I don't sit at powerful policy tables. I don't work in the UN, have, access. What I do is research. And I think I would like to see the work that I and people like myself do be about providing the evidence that counters the lies. I think we're in a world where, social media, etc., it's really hard to get heard above all the noise. So people tell outright lies. There's a lot of fake news, false news. You don't know what to believe anymore. So I think for those of us who work on research and evidence, we all do what we can. I think our role is to get that evidence out there, not to just talk to each other in academia, not just to publish in books and publications that nobody reads by other scholars. I mean, that's what we're encouraged to do. It's really public. When Romania was under Ceausescu, he banned all academic journals except Econometrica, because no one understands it. Academics have a way of talking to each other. And their progress depends on how well they communicate to each other, but not how well they communicate to the public. So I think I've always been a bridge builder. I've always tried to cross over to the policy side and to the active side. I think more and more we need to do that as a much more concerted effort. And so I think it means looking for forums, wherever they might be, publishing in places that reach people that we don't know reach. But there's one other thing, MEP, the right to free speech is not an absolute right? And when I talk to people, can we not regulate social media on Twitter to women who put their heads above the parapet in any way? Why should that be allowed? These are huge companies, Elon Musk and all these people. They're rich individuals. How do they decide what is the right to free speech? The right to free speech has always gone with responsibilities. And the right to abuse women, or anyone who doesn't conform in some way to the norm. I think that's another campaign I would like to see. I know that Germany has taken steps, some countries have taken steps to start regulating. In Britain, when young girls have committed suicide because of the kind of influence that they've seen, then people start to worry a little bit, because children tug at our heartstrings in a way that adult women don't. But a lot of adult women are, I think Diane Abbott, one of the few Black women when they analyze the tweets, she got the most abuse, and it was racist. It was awful. How she lost there year after year. And who was saying? One of you was saying about it's not fair that men should be able to go out and do the things they do without too much trouble. It's not fair that women can't go into politics or go into powerful positions without having this torrent of abuse by inadequate men hiding somewhere behind an anonymous name, probably failing at everything.
Tell us, how's your experience?
Yes, thank you so much. I remembered I entered the European Parliament. One of my first interviews on television was about, so can you imagine, one of my first interviews on television as an MEP, and it was very early in the mandate, was about the hate I received on social media. So I was like already the very first day, so if this is going to be my life 5 years, so how will I survive? And to be honest, if you ask me, oh, what are you so happy about since you're leaving politics this summer, then that's my first answer. Oh, I don't need to look at my Twitter anymore. I don't get the responses anymore. And my dear team always tells me, please, Samira, don't look at Twitter. We do it for you and we'll filter it, we'll report, and then after that you can look at it. But I mean, that's the life of female politicians. It's terrible. And then also the intersectionality comes in. So when you're young, woman of color, well, jackpot. That's the most toxic cocktail that you can have. And in general, what I hear, but it doesn't matter the background, the background of women doesn't matter here. They all say, if there's one reason why I would leave politics, then it's now the social media attacks and also the threats. So we receive also threats. I have also experienced myself with threats. Sometimes female politicians also receive death threats. And the conversation that we need to have with the big tech is you need to moderate. You have the power, you have the means, you have the access, you know how your algorithms work. And that's exactly the conversation I have, because I also work a lot on AI in the European Parliament, on ethical AI. We have the so-called Digital Service Act now. That's really about the behavior of the big tech, making sure that the platform users are becoming more safe and comfortable at the platform. But we also have the AI Act, of course, in place that needs to regulate now algorithms and make sure that it works all ethically. So I do think we are going to make good steps. And in my conversations with the big tech, I do notice that they do a lot, that they try to do a lot, and even more at least, to protect female politicians, because they now made it a very specific topic. So I know that some of the big tech is now making it a specific topic for the upcoming elections, to make sure that they can help female politicians and female political candidates to be and feel more safe. But it's absolutely ridiculous that this is one of the main reasons now why women leave politics. And why they are happy that they leave politics. So like I said, if I would mention one reason for me to be happy that I'll leave politics this summer, it's the social media. And then we have a serious problem, because it means that we are censored also in a way. And it means that we are being limited in our participation in politics. And then again, these decision-making tables come in. It means that we won't be there. So the impact should not be underestimated. And I always tell the big tech, and that's also luckily what the European Parliament now says in general, big tech, you have the responsibility to make sure that people are safe. Because at a certain point, it's not about freedom of speech anymore. And these anti-gender movements, by the way, that we are now doing the research on, their main tactics now is social media. So they are very organized on social media. They target individuals. I mean, if I tweet about them, about these anti-gender movements, I cannot look at my Twitter for 2 days. I cannot look at it. So they are very targeted, very well organized, and they know about algorithms. They know the technology. Social media is also nowadays a weapon against individuals, politicians, journalists, and so on, to censor them and to make sure that they stop doing what they are doing. So also here we need to have a counter strategy.
The last question now is going to be for you, Jemima. So obviously we frame this around CSW. You're no doubt going to be having a fairly central role. The focus is going to be on gender, poverty, and economic empowerment. So we've heard already how backlash is manifesting in terms of lack of financial support, in the language of outcome documents. Where are you seeing the biggest challenges, and what is most needed to advance women's economic empowerment at CSW this year and beyond?
Thank you for that question. I think we are organizing this CSW at a time when the world is not a good place. One of the things that we know now is that we have so many women and girls living in conflict. The number of women and girls living in conflict since 2017 has actually doubled. So we are closely aware that there's a lot of hardships, whether it's violence, food insecurity, etc., that women are grappling with, especially in these conflict situations. So that is going to be a big focus at CSW, and how we actually ensure that we do not, that we have agreements that at least go towards ensuring that more women do not fall into poverty. The second thing that's going to be top of mind and under discussion, and we've mentioned this before, is financing and how to reform the current financial architecture, because we know it's not working for the majority. It is not working for those who have been left behind. And so the Secretary General's report is very clear that a reforming of the global financial architecture must happen for us to address issues of poverty. One of the reports that we do with UNDESA, the gender snapshot, and some analysis we've done with UNCTAD, is showing we have a funding gap of about $360 billion a year for gender equality. Now, this is a very, very tiny fraction of the global expenditure on the military and arms. And so we are directing resources into the wrong things that are actually even causing more poverty for women and girls. So there's going to be some hard conversations about financing and how that financial architecture then supports poverty eradication for women. There is also a couple of priorities on the table around reducing women's poverty, some of which we've been talking about: the role of jobs, the role of social protection, and how much expenditure and financing is actually going to supporting women's financial inclusion, women's jobs, and access to public services, including social protection and care services. And so if our hope is that we can get to some discussions with member states around how to increase the investments in women's economic empowerment, how to increase investments in addressing women's poverty in some of the areas that we've been discussing here today. Overall, we also want to talk about strengthening institutions, and this includes accountability institutions, tax justice systems. So those are also challenges, and I think, Naila, you alluded to this earlier when you talk about how much wealth and how much finances are held by individuals that are not paying tax and that are not and that's financing that isn't going to what it is supposed to do. So making sure that we are also discussing with governments around issues of tax accountability and tax justice. Because at the end of the day, if we do not drive resources into poverty reduction, into poverty eradication, into providing citizens with, and especially those that have been left behind, women and girls, and other groups that have been left behind, if we cannot drive those kinds of investments, then I think the world is going to be a much worse place for women and girls overall. So that's what we are hoping for CSW, that we can come to agreements and to some conclusions with member states around what really needs to be done in terms of financing for gender equality.
Thank you so much. I feel like we've really gained a lot of insight from all three of you. Thank you very much. I'm now keen to bring you all into the conversation as well. So we have quite a lot of people here, so I'm probably going to prioritize the room. But if you have online questions, please send them and we'll try to get to them. So yeah, over to you, really. If you have a question, please put your hand up. Please introduce yourself and please make sure you're asking a question. So we've got one here at the front. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you. So George van Montfort, Deputy for UNDP here in Brussels. Thanks for the invite and for the very inspiring conversation. A lot of thoughts, a lot of reflections. One, embarrassment that I think we're here now and we hear these stories. So I really, yeah, it's disheartening almost to see the backsliding. And it's sort of on a personal level and on a professional level, we see this coming back. And just starting with an anecdote, when I moved with my wife's job, even her educated friends, master degrees, were questioning why she was ruining her men's career. When she then moved with me, no questions asked. Right? These are educated women and men in a society where I thought, I'm from the Netherlands as well, where I thought gender equality wasn't so questioned, but it is. So that's first and foremost, I think, fundamental backsliding, but also we were not even where we should have been. So it's even worse, right? We're backsliding from a disadvantaged position. For UNDP, for us, it's fundamental. So we've got a new program called Economics, where we really look at fundamental structures of our economy needs to change, from financing to privatization to taxing to trade, as you said. So we're really working on that. And with that, working with the public institutions that need to actually fundamentally change, right? So the gender equality seal for us is an important tool where we work with institutions to see how attuned they are to actually making those changes that they need to change. And then there's a lot at sort of the community level they're doing together with UN Women on women's economic empowerment. And let me end with that, because I think I agree with you, it's hard to have hope, but I still think as development professionals, we need to continue having that hope. For me, Afghanistan, the most terrible situation ever. We shifted when the Taliban took over to community level development and to women's economic empowerment, because we saw there was an opportunity to give them that agency, to make sure that they kept their little bit of agency that was there. And we're working with 40,000 SMMEs who employ now women and are still, with a miracle, still alive and working. We think partially because the Taliban understands that they need it. So there is agency and there is power. They're not doing this because they don't see it. It's not on their radar. They need this. And hopefully it starts a little bit of hope for those women, but also for the society at large. So, but thank you for inspiring. The one thing I noticed, predominantly women, we need to get the men into these rooms and talk. Thank you.
Any other questions in the room?
Hi, Daniel from International Organization for Migration. Because you talked about intersectionalities, I think it's important also to make sure that no women are left behind. And I think when we talk about migrant women, transgender women, and others, I find that they're often not also the tables of discussion. So I think this is a question for everybody, but also because you have mentioned it about how can we better include them, because I find that discussions tends to be very binary, cisgender related, and there's very little room for them, in spite of the fact that, of course, they're quite behind many times.
Question. Thank you. Any more?
Maybe to give face to some of the challenges that, sorry, my name is Angela Machones. I'm working with the Global Partnership for Education under the World Bank, to give face to some of the entrenched gender norms that are there. I was married off at 16, and thought you talked about the opportunities that are created, and then we dismantle gender norms. But even at 40, I'm turning 40 this year, I'm still fighting gender norms. I also came here. I moved out of that marriage and came out from Zimbabwe to Brussels to work. And the question I get is, what about your marriage? What about your children? Yeah, so even out of that, child marriage situation, managed to come out of it with a lot of societal challenges and family questions as well. Now, talking about getting into politics, one of the issues and gender norms that are less talked about is menopause and how much that issue is not understood. And women who are, surviving menopausal challenges are seen as they are crazy, even in the political space. I'm extremely happy that UN Women now has a gender norms desk, rightfully with Nyaradzai Kumbonjanda. It will be critical to have these discussions at all levels, because even if you come out well-educated, with educated men, with educated women as well, driving the patriarchal challenges, we are still facing tons of challenges. So an important conversation that we've had today, and we need to go in multi levels, at the individual direct level, but also at that international and indirect level, ensuring that governments invest so much in the education of children, in the education of teachers, because in as much as you can have, teachers and access to education, and you still have teachers that have stereotypical tendencies, we are not having much change. So I think this has been great, and it's important to also have women of color in these multinational spaces, because we bring voice, we also bring experiences. Even in the workplace, we are still facing tons of challenges, even with our female counterparts.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing your experience. There's 2 more questions and then we can start answering them.
Thank you very much. My name is Kaji Laye. I am the representative for the International Fund for Agricultural Development. I wanted to make 2 points. One, I also like very much the whole discussion around intersection and the barriers, and discrimination. One group of women I wanted to highlight is rural women. Beyond that, beyond race and other issues, rural women face particular challenges, and would like that to be considered within the whole fight for economic empowerment, the challenges facing the women. The second point I wanted to make is, cannot emphasize more about focusing also on the opportunity cost of excluding the whole section of the. So we often talk about the impact it has on women, but what about on the bigger society? Now, it's being calculated what the economic cost is for all society when women are excluded from certain areas of life, in the business world, in politics, etc. How much does the global economy lose when women are excluded? Because I think this is a powerful argument towards those who try to exclude women. It's not just about improving the lives of one section or half of the population, but for all the population, because there is a huge economic cost. It's smart economics, it's smart business sense, actually include certain. So that point, I think, is a key argument. We should not, or we cannot overemphasize.
And maybe take one last one. It's just hear it.
Unless there's somebody else who.
Okay, please go.
My name is Ronnie Deshpande. I am working with CDAP, which is a financial inclusion think tank at the World Bank. And my question is, when I think about, so what are the most powerful levers that we can exercise to get at everything that has been discussed today, including the norms, including the direct sources of economic empowerment? I can't get away from the economic, borrow a French word, valorisation, economic validation of care work that would automatically address assets. It would automatically, well, not automatically, but it would address norms. It would address the legitimate care needs that families have that someone has to fulfill. It would also potentially address some of the perverse consequences we see for the most vulnerable girls. Again, it's a client segment that I work on. And I would just love to hear from the panelists whether you can think of a more powerful lever. And also, the reaction I always get to this is, well, how are you going to pay for this? And my answer would also be a big fat tax on those who are not. And when I speak to, for example, my husband, who's an economist who used to work on Capitol Hill in the US, he says your big fat tax is a big fat chance of getting passed. So I'd love to hear particularly from Samira. Is there any more possibility of instituting something like that in a place that's, let's say, more advanced than where I come from, and I'm talking about the US? Thank you.
I have an online question. Online
Got
question.
one more here. Okay, one from the back.
I introduced myself before from ODI. First of all, I'd like to say how distressed I am to hear that you're leaving politics. Because it seems to me you're a huge political force. So I understand all the issues around social media. I'll just put a plug in for work that Rachel's led on social media and boys and the effect it's having on boys. As well as we did background work on algorithms and where our lies in algorithms. So happy to share that with you. But I wanted to ask about your prognosis on FFP, which you mentioned. Maybe you could explain what processes you could see unfolding if there is a sort of move to the right.
So just to quickly, we've got this one just now that will come to you. We've got the one on the most powerful levers basically in the valuing of care, and then just a few on rural women, on migrant women, and maybe this point here is about so-called like educated people also internalizing gender.
Do you want me always to respond to take it?
Whichever you want.
Yeah, all right. Okay.
Just a couple, like 1 or 2 minutes, I think we can go to each of you.
All right, I'll try. As a politician, I choose for the 2 minutes then. Just your point on migrant women is very valid because indeed we did a report on intersectionality that was mainly focused on the access of migrant women to healthcare services and the participation of migrant women, and that was also what the intersectionality report was about. And the statistics and the numbers were very worrying, especially when it comes to the access to healthcare and the information that they receive on healthcare, for example. So what I truly think needs to happen on the EU level, even though healthcare is a member state competence, because you always get into that discussion, but what really needs to happen is a duty of member states to keep investing in the access to healthcare, but all kinds of other public services for migrant women, because the statistics are very bad and we have the facts at the table. So we really need to cooperate strongly here on an institutional level, multilateral level, together with the local municipalities, of course, of the member states, to get the right policies in place. So that would be my approach if I would be in charge of it. But I will still keep pushing for it, of course, for the last months that I'll be here, because it's exactly a topic that I still work on. So then when it comes to the menopause, very, very important that you've mentioned that this is exactly what I've meant with also the menstrual and hormone related issues. Even this week, I had an event on endometriosis. And in the same range, I mentioned also menopause. This is exactly a kind of issue that is underestimated, that is not being talked about. It's in the taboo sphere. Also when it comes to PMS, menstrual pain, etc. Women cannot work because of all the complaints that they have. A lot of women have very severe pain. Indeed, the menopause, the response that you get to it is very, very terrible sometimes. So I totally agree. And I am going to work these months on the manifesto also. A 5 points manifesto that I will launch on that point. On the gender and on the menstrual and hormone related issues, including menopause. Then when it comes to the rural women, thank you so much for mentioning that. It reminds me of the EU Africa strategy that I've been working on also, because also in that strategy, we've mentioned the importance of rural, the development of the rural area, agriculture, but also the opportunities we have there with female women in agriculture. So I do hope that also from the EU side, through, for example, the Global Gateway projects and more, there will be significant investment in the rural area, taking into account women and youth. These are the two target groups that I always speak about. But happy to speak with you and elaborate on it. And then when it comes to the economic costs, indeed, I always say, if you don't want to hear the soft story, then I'll tell you the hard story. And that's indeed, we are losing billions. For example, with the Netherlands, the McKinsey report shows that we are losing billions on an annual basis because we don't have gender equality. So can you imagine if we have gender equality, we'll be very, very rich and our economy will flourish. So that's also the story that I always tell. And then my last point on the best practice to get it more institutionalized. Well, best practice that we have been working with in the European Parliament is gender mainstreaming. Indeed, gender budgeting, it was mentioned before, but also gender mainstreaming, all the committees, the legislation that is being put forward. I think that is a really good example of how you can build in more safeguards. And at the end, for the EU side, it is important to keep pushing the member states to also do that on a member state level, on regional level, on a local level, through conventions, for example, take also the Istanbul Convention, but all kinds of conventions that can make sure that member states abide to these rules and treaties. But the first thing I thought about when you were asking the question is gender mainstreaming on an institutional level. I don't know if that's 2 minutes. But
You're clearly a very good politician. Let's go to Jemima then next. Just again, 1 or 2 minutes, please, Jemima. Any quick reflection on the questions and comments that you've heard?
Thank you. So a couple of reflections. First, on the stereotypes around work. And I think what is really worrying for us at UN Women is we are seeing these stereotypes even entrench deeper with young people. That young people are, when we ask in surveys, if there's a job, who should get the job? And when you see about 30 to 40% of young people saying the man should be preferred over a woman in economic, in economic opportunities and jobs, we really have to do much more work in terms of engaging, especially young men, around gender equality. And our programs, including, we have a network called the Unstereotype Alliance to also start changing how women and girls are represented in media as part of changing those stereotypes. The question from IOM, it's really important that we take an intersectional approach. Thinking about migrant women, we are working very closely with IOM on this. We actually have an event first thing tomorrow morning looking at migrant women from how to invest in migrant women, but also looking at some of the barriers that they're facing. When we look even at the gender pay gap, we see such a big gap when we disaggregate the data by migrant women or racialized women. So we really need to take an intersectional approach in this work. The issue of menopause, it's really interesting. Every year we do a report called the Global Food 50-50 that we do alongside the Global Health 50-50. It's an organization where we look at 200 organizations and the workplace policies that they have. And last year, out of 200 organizations, only one organization had a policy on menopause. And so a lot of our work, we are really making sure that we take a life cycle approach, because what this means is women cannot bring their full selves to the workplace if these policies are not in place, if they're not recognized, if menopause is not recognized as an area of focus for organizations. So even in our care work, we're really making sure that we take a life cycle approach. On the economic imperative, it's important that we focus on what economies lose by not having gender equality, but even equally important is what they gain by having gender equality. So we think of gender equality both as a human right and as an economic imperative. It's what Samira said. There is the human rights argument and there is the economic argument. We do not also just want to instrumentalize women as they will contribute to the economy and not because they actually deserve those same human rights. And so we also want to make sure that we are not losing the human right argument, that women do deserve to thrive in society, and policies, investments must make sure that happens. And very quickly on investments in care, one of the things we're really investing in is supporting governments around data. Because when they start to see what is the contribution of the care economy to jobs, what is the contribution of the care of investing in the care economy for gender equality, once you put this data, so for example, one of our assessments, we're doing these country assessments that showed that investments in the care sector actually contributes more jobs than the investments governments are doing in construction. Then they actually sit down and think about what kind of investments do we then need to be making. A lot of countries are not collecting time use data. A lot of countries, when they even think about what's the contribution of different sectors to the economy, they're not looking at the care sector as an important part of that contribution. So I think if we can support more data on the table around the investment case for the care economy from a broad perspective, I think it's going to make a huge difference.
Thanks, Jemima. Naila.
Any thoughts? I'll take up 2 points. I think the first is about intersectionality, and I think all my work shows me, not my own direct research, but the research I do on other people's research, shows me that if you map the jobs in an economy from the best paid and the most formal and the ones everyone wants to do, and you go all the way down the job hierarchy to the worst jobs, the ones that pay badly, they don't pay at all, the hours are long, there's no contract, there's no protections. And then if you map people along those, you will find intersectionality. Those jobs at the bottom of the hierarchy are where color, race, indigeneity, location all come together, and migrant status is very much one of them. So my research is on those people I find in my part of the world at the bottom of the hierarchy, and that is around caste, ethnicity, location, indigeneity. But I imagine if you look at Brazil, you would come up with a different map. But I think mapping people to job hierarchies tells you everything you want to know about intersectionality, how it plays out in that society. My second point is about growth. And I did a very interesting study with a colleague about gender equality and economic growth. So we find across many studies, longitudinal, cross-sectional, etc., gender equality in education and employment contributes to the pace of economic growth, right? But we asked a reverse question. Does economic growth contribute to gender equality? Now, there are reasons why we got very mixed findings. When we measure growth, we have one single statistic, right, GDP. When we measure gender equality, we have many different indicators. So one part of the problem was that there were many different indicators, so you didn't get a clear result. But another part of the problem is that actually patterns of growth matter. You know, if you have an oil economy, it's likely to hire men and it's likely to exclude women. If you have export-oriented economies, it's likely to hire So the patterns of growth matter. Patterns of growth matter also for women's well-being. So the fastest growing economies in the world, India and China, have the worst sex ratios at birth because they are both the female child. So, there is nothing about the growth that we have today that is at all cares about people particularly. So I think Jemima talked earlier about, what do we need to go beyond growth? What do we need? How do we put people's well-being, justice, safety, etc., into measuring how well a country is doing? Clean air, clean water, and all. But my final point is the McKinsey report. It was very interesting. I think it came out in 2016 or 2017. And it said, if you had gender parity, not just in labor force participation, but in all the different sectors of the economy, the world would gain 28 trillion dollars, but you also need gender equality at home. It's the first time I've seen an economic report tell us you can't expect women to go into the labor market and not have a double burden unless you take care of what is happening at home. So that economic validation argument that you're talking about, for me, that's part of the argument. But another part of the argument is it's about the lost resources, that you are not using. Just because I'm a woman doesn't mean I'm the best person to be doing this job. So you really want distribution of talent and so on across the economy. I think, and when we recognize that what women are doing in the domestic domain as unpaid care, it is a public good. What they're producing is labor, children, citizens of tomorrow, mothers, parents, fathers, etc. And if they're not happy doing it, they're going to produce some very difficult people in the future. I mean, I don't know how to put it, but you know what I mean. So what you want is, the validation you want is that they should be supported. It should be seen as a collective responsibility rather than the individual responsibility of an isolated one.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists here. I'm just going to pass over to Florence now to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just weird. I don't know if I need a microphone well, first of all, thank you. I think thank you, Naila, Jemima, Samira, really very thank you, Rachel, as well. Thank you to the moderation in name of our both organizations, ODI and UN Women. I think it was very, very, very rich. I think it was also, it is very concerning. I think we started with saying that. And I think one observation as well in thinking on a way forward. First of all, I think I started by saying that when we crossed in Brussels, recently arrived, both we said, this sounds like a good, smart and encouraging thing to do, good energies. But I think it's when I'm saying ODI UN Women Partnership, and we agreed to have a series of, we call them we say gender talks, Brussels gender talks. And so this is the first one of a series that we will organize in the different areas that relate and came up today, women, peace, security, conflict, today's world, climate, technologies, AI, and energy. But I think hearing all of us, and we'll plot later, but I think talks is not enough, you're right? And I think we already discussed it right before. Definitely we're at the time, and everybody has his DNA, like you said, I think. And it's really beautiful to see research, to see international organization and politics. But I think we all put the focus as well on women's organizations, right? And on feminist organizations. So when I go from the richness of the conversation, looking at today's reality 1 year before what Beijing plus 30, and knowing that and all the rights that flew with it internationally, regionally, nationally, are largely due or only due to women's energy and women's organizations. I think we all have a moral responsibility as well to go beyond talks. And we are not going to do that alone. I think we need to definitely strategize on where each of us stand, how we can do that from the place that we're in, and thinking definitely of mine, of ours, let's say, in Brussels, and looking at the elections, looking at what the EU means for the world in terms of growth, conflict, political shifts, inclusion, exclusion, but also knowing the vibrant energy of research, think tank, civil society that there is in Brussels. I think beyond the talks, we definitely need to find alliances, because I look at the room and I think you mentioned it, and super thanks, UN colleagues, thanks to the European Union, thanks to the different organizations, civil society, think tanks, but we're talking among ourselves. And it's just a criticism for me, don't take it for you. We're preaching to the convinced. And I think it definitely takes this comfortable space, and it takes us to think and have that honest assessment of how do we do the step that will actually convince that middle ground. Because I think, Naila, you're the one who said, you know, arguments and evidence, and yes, I think like I said, I've been away for 20 years and just came back to Europe, and it's a bit shocking because when I left, and I've done Africa, Latin America, I went away, and that's what I heard from young women in Africa and Latin America. It's sort of, okay, it's not perfect, but let's say the glass half full, right? And actually it's not. I found the glass more half full in Africa because the way is still not everywhere, but you have less of a backlash, at least at rhetorical levels. Maybe if you look at rights, they're not there, but young girls are getting educated, and I come back here and the glass half empty, actually. It's really, the dynamic is a lot more depressing, even if the picture is maybe still from a region that has rights, where women have entitlements. And I hear from my friends, like I think some of you were saying, from boys and girls, it's not an issue anymore. Either we don't care, either, you know, the whole idea of just maternity is fine as well. And so it takes a lot of thinking as well on the feminist movement and of us gender activists, of how have we not managed maybe to include boys? And I know we're working a lot on it, Jemima, so it's not, I'm not saying that we're not doing it, but I think beyond the actual facts and evidence, it's about the narrative, and which narrative, because I found myself in various situations in various countries with the best data ever, and you're not going to convince them because, like you said, it's power, it's money. You do whatever research it takes, it's mafia, it's trafficking beyond what you can imagine, right? So I think it is about those that can be convinced, and it is very, very urgent. So what I'm taking away, and what I'm not closing with, because I don't want this to close, is that it was very interesting, but it's an urgent call for action of all of us, actually. And I think what I take away from it for us, but all of us in the room, is what will we do from Brussels to at least try, you know, to put a small un grain de sel, then I go with the French. So I think this said, of course, thank you for your energy, thank you for your positive energy, thank you for being allies and partners, and we'll need each other. So we'll socialize around drinks and make sure we keep in touch. But I think beyond just seeing each other at the different talks on the different areas, it's also a call for us to really try to support each other, because we'll need it, but also try to strategize and find ways that we can actually, like we said, when women push back against the pushback, we need to start pushing there. And I think youth and education are definitely one of the keys, and we're all parents as well. So it goes back to what you were saying about the collective and about the individual. So with that said, and a sense of responsibility, let's get some drinks as well, and let's get a cocktail, because otherwise it's too heavy for today. Thank you very much.